welcome to the third lesson of the course, Moving Past the Basics. Today we'll be covering checkmating the lone king and other mating patterns. So the first topic we're going to cover is king and queen versus king. So exactly how do we set up a checkmate? Well, the idea is to trap the opponent's king on one of the four sides of the board, whether it be the first rank, the 8th rank, the A file, or the H file. And we can do this by using something called the square rule. So I'm going to illustrate this with my very first move. Queen d4 check. Now, besides attacking this king, this queen controls a lot more than this diagonal. It controls the entire 4th rank and all of the d file. So if you focus on the side the black king is on, then you can see the square here. The queen controls these 4 squares here and these 4 squares here, essentially capturing black's king in this box, this 4x4 box right here. And white does not want to let black escape this box. So black can move away, say to e6, and white wants to make sure that this box is not changing size. If anything, it's getting smaller. So he can do this by, say, playing his queen to c5, trapping his king even further. His king can no longer advance past the 5th rank. If the king tries to move away, white will simply shrink the box even more, again limiting the number of squares the king can go to. Now you see it's a 4x3 box. So the king can keep moving away, but as long as white keeps the number of squares available to the king the same or less than the previous move, then white will be in good shape. So I'm going to keep shrinking the box, keep forcing the king to the other side of the board. And now you can see the number of available squares to him has decreased. So let's say you push the king back even more. Let's say you do it even more. Now, when the king goes into the corner, your goal is to trap the king along one of these 2 files or ranks. However, you want to avoid something called stalemate. And stalemate is a special rule that says if the king is not in check, but he does not have any legal moves, then the game is a draw. And this is definitely something white wants to avoid, because he certainly does not want to draw. So if white played a move like queen f7 here, thinking to himself, wow, I've really limited the moves of this king. He can't even go anywhere anymore. This would be stalemate and the game would be a draw, because the king has no squares to move to. Cannot go to g7, can't go to g8, nor can it go to h7. So white has to think of the available moves for black, and he should play a move like queen e7, accomplishing his goal of trapping the king along one of the 4 sides of the board, but leaving him some room to breathe. So now this king can shuffle between g8 and h8. Now comes the second step of the process. While the king is doing its thing, moving back and forth here, white can now bring his king into the game. So let's just make a few moves. So the king shuffles, white king moves closer, and closer, and closer, until the king is trapped over here. Now here, white can choose from many different options on how he wants to checkmate black. The most common is sticking the queen right in front of the king. So queen h7 would be checkmate, because the queen is supported by the king, and this king's in check and cannot escape. However, because the king's on the edge of the board, there's even more options available to you. You can even checkmate on g7, or you can checkmate on d8, e8, or even f8. Now, what if the king was over here, let's say, in the middle of the board as opposed to the edge? Then here, white would only have one option, which is to stick the queen right in front of the king. So this is checkmating with a king and queen versus a king. Now, the next position I want to show you is a mating pattern with 2 rooks. And I like to call this the ladder, because this checkmate can be performed without any help from the king whatsoever. So how does it work? Imagine each one of these rooks controlling a file or a rank, which is pretty evident. This rook controls the 4th rank and the b file. This rook controls the 3rd rank and the a file. So what white wants to do is to push the king over again to one of the 4 sides of the board. Use one of the rooks to cover any of the forward escape squares, which means the king can't escape the side, and then simply put the other rook on the last rank and checkmate the black king. So this sounds a little bit difficult when I talk about it, but when I put it into action, it'll make a lot more sense. So here we can start something called the ladder, and these rooks will look like they're climbing a ladder. So after a move like rook a5 check, the king moves. This rook will follow up with its brother rook, check the king again. Now, if the king moves away, then it's very simple. You can just simply follow up with another check, and then a very simple checkmate. So this pattern is called the ladder. But black can make it a little more difficult for white. Let's say in this position, after check, he decides to play king c7, attacking the rook. Now check is impossible because his rook is under attack. So now what white does is he simply swings his rook to the other side of the board, where it can perform the exact same purpose. So he can swing his rook all the way over here. If the black king moves over, he can swing his other rook all the way over there. Now, regardless of what the king does, it's mate in a bit. Check again, and the rook finishes climbing the ladder. So now let's set up the next position. And this is probably the hardest one yet. And it's checkmating with just a rook. Now, unlike the other two positions with a queen and two rooks, this rook requires his king in order to force the opponent's king to one of the four sides of the board. He can't do it alone. Like the queen could force the king to the side of the board alone, the two rooks could perform the ladder technique, but this rook will need some help from his friendly king. And the technique of doing this is remarkably similar to the technique used with the queen. Again, it's called the box technique, or the square rule. So my very first move, I'm going to declare the box that this king is in. You can see I control these four squares here, and these four squares here, or the squares along the fourth rank and the d file, and this king is limited to this 4x4 square. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my king to support my rook, and I'm never going to let my opponent's king escape this square. This square is either going to stay the same, or it's going to shrink. I can't let him escape because then I have to start again from scratch. So let's say, for example, the king moves over. How can I shrink the square? Well, it's very simple. All I have to do is move the rook over one space, where it's still defended by the king, but now this king is in a 3x4 square. So if the king moves over, it's the same thing. I'm going to shrink the square even more. So the king's going to take a chance and say move backwards. Well, this rook's going to need some help. It can't go anywhere where it can shrink the square. If it moves away, the king escapes. If it moves forward, the king escapes. Moves anywhere else, the king can escape. So I'm going to bring my king in. Notice that the square is not shrunk, but it stayed the same size. So let's say the king moves away. I'm going to ask myself, how can I shrink this square even more? And I notice, well, if I bring my rook up, now he's stuck in a 3x3 square. So the king, let's say, moves back. I'm going to think for a bit, and I realize that I can't shrink the square anymore. If I move my rook anywhere else, this king will escape. So what do? I simply move my king to a square where it still defends the rook. And if the king moves back, let's say to here, I'm going to repeat the process and shrink the square even more. So I'm going to repeat this multiple times. I'm going to try going this way perhaps. Shrink the square a bit more like this. And finally shrink the square so much that the king is stuck on one of the four sides. And once it's on one of the four sides, the square doesn't really matter anymore. The only important thing is that it does not escape, which means it stays on either the 8th rank, the 1st rank, the A file, or the H file. So let's see what happens now. The king has no choice but to move over. What I'm going to do, I'm going to put my rook on the side opposite to that of the king. So I'm going to put it all the way over here. Let's say this king now has no choice but to move back, and I play my king here. Now you see, if the king moves over again, let's say to here, then we have set up our checkmating position. When these two kings are opposing each other, one side can checkmate the other side by bringing his rook to the last rank, where it checks the king and it can't escape because all these squares are covered by either the rook or the king. So naturally, black doesn't want to do this, so he moves over. What white can do then is he's going to move over again, and this king has run out of squares to go to. He has no choice but to return back, and then the checkmate is very simple. Let's make this a bit harder. In this position, what if it was black to move? Let's say he moves like here. Now white naturally says, well, I want to check my opponent's king, so I know I have to be in front of him, so he goes here. Now black goes back. White hasn't made any progress because whenever he opposes his opponent's king, the king simply moves out of the way. And of course, checkmate doesn't happen anymore because the king can escape. So what can white possibly do in this position? The answer is, remember before, he was wasting a move with his king in order to keep the square the same size. Now, to make sure he opposes his opponent's king, he's going to swing his rook to the opposite side of the king. Now, if this king moves over, the checkmate, of course, is quite simple. So black has no choice but to run in the other direction, and white will simply follow him until he hits the edge of the board, where he's run out of moves to go to. And once he goes back, the checkmate is very simple. And that's how you checkmate with a king and a rook. So we're going to cover two more checkmates, or two common mating patterns, I should say. And they're going to look something like this. So, I'm sure you remember castling. The king ends up, if he kingside castles, here on g1 or g8 if you're black. So, what happens when you castle is your king can be quite safe. However, there's the danger of being stuffed in by your own pieces. And I'm going to illustrate this with this checkmate. So this checkmate is called the back rank because the king is on the back rank. And all white has to do is to put either a queen or a rook on the back rank and deliver check, and this king can't escape because his pawns are blocking his escape routes. So after, say, black captures, white captures back, and it's checkmate. And this is known as the back rank checkmate. Now, the last mating pattern I'm going to cover is something that every beginner chess player should know, and it's called the scholar's mate. Basically, what white is trying to do is he's trying to checkmate his opponent as quickly as possible, and he wants to target a very weak square, and this square is the f7 pawn. Now, the f7 pawn here is weak because it's only defended by the king in the beginning position, and white wants to take advantage of this. So what he's going to do is that he's going to use his queen and his light squared bishop to target this pawn. So let me play through a few moves. After e4, e5, queen h5, white attacks the e-pawn and the f-pawn. So let's say black defends the e-pawn here with his knight. Now white will bring his light squared bishop out and attack f7 again. And if black isn't careful, if he plays like a simple move and attacks the queen, then white can pounce on the f7 square, which is only defended by the king, and deliver checkmate. Now, this isn't limited to the move order. White can say play bishop c4 first, or he can even move his queen to f3. It doesn't matter, as long as you result in the same position where this bishop is defending this queen on f7, that's delivering check to the king, and he can't escape. Thank you for watching this video. Now go ahead and apply what you learned to the exercises.